We begin our time together by acknowledging that UBC is located on the ancestral, unceded, and stolen territory of the Ďʻaņkabinu-speaking Musqueam peoples. As we are reflecting on questions of refuge today, it's something I would not have said 10 years ago, I think, but I think today we can really say it's a tradition that is under existential threat, given political developments across the globe. And I'm reflecting on Musqueam and Squamish elders who have spoken to us about their traditions of welcoming strangers who come with good intention. And I'm struck by the contrast between that welcoming embrace and what we see across the world in terms of deterrence and externalization of asylum, and the fact that the Geneva Refugee Convention really has been hollowed out in many places beyond recognition. So I would like to welcome you to the fourth and our final event in our this year's speaker series. The speaker series is called Migration, Migration, Racialization, and Inequality. And we've had a fantastic 3 events leading up to this, and I'm really happy that we're now at a point where, we kind of have our final event and can also reflect on what we've learned over the year in terms of trying to look at the intersection of racialization, inequality, and migration. The series, when we composed the series, we really wanted to shine the spotlight on how systemic disparities contribute or intersect with migration, and also how migrants resist those inequalities. So both kind of structural changes, political changes, but also resistance. And today's talk is going to be focused on the intersection of race, refuge, and of course, migration. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Antje Ellerman. I'm the co-director of the Center for Migration Studies. I'm just so thrilled to see all of you. I know this is a really busy time of the term. Everybody's just kind of in survival mode, attending things they really have to attend. And I know very few of you have to be here. So thank you for your time, for your generosity of coming early to eat food, to talk to each other. It's really meaningful to see that. And we really, all of us appreciate that. I want to begin by acknowledging our many staff who've made this event possible. I want to thank Padma Chattopadhyay. I want to thank Marie Frileux. I want to thank Gabrielle Dampis-Woolever, Maya Joel, and also our graduate academic assistants, Xian Liu and Ziwen Mei. Again, you can plan whatever you want to, however much you want to plan, but it really takes people to make something like this happen. And I know we always get feedback about the beautiful space, the hospitality here, the attention to detail, how well the tech setup, fingers crossed, works. And that's all because of the expertise we have in the room in terms of all of those supporting us with their ideas and their labor. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Laura Madokoro. She's a historian and an associate professor in the Department of History at Carleton, which is located on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. She's a proud UBC alumnus. I actually did not know that about you. And I'm the author of 2 books. One is called Elusive Refuge, Chinese Migrants in the Cold War, published by Harvard University Press in 2016. And then very, very recently, this is really brand new work, which is so fantastic, her book titled Sanctuary in Pieces, 2 Centuries of Flight, Fugitivity, and Resistance in a North American City, published by McGill Queen's University Press just last year. And she also has published numerous articles on race, migration, and humanitarianism. She's a member of the editorial collectives for Active History and Refugee History, and co-director of the journal Histoire Sociale, Social History. Laura, we're really excited to have you with us and look forward to you sharing your research with us. Okay. And please join me in welcoming Laura Madokoro.
Thank you, Antje. Thank you, everyone. I'm checking that the sound is okay. I want to measure up to these technical expectations. It's such a pleasure to be here. So I want to start by thanking everyone for coming. I know that it is indeed a very busy time of the year, and it's really lovely to see new faces and familiar faces. I finished my PhD here in 2012, which is somehow over a decade ago, but it feels like just yesterday, and it's really a pleasure to be back on campus. So thank you for the invitation to come and talk about my work and to talk about it in the context of this really important theme. I wish I could have been here for the other speakers in the series. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit, as the title of the presentation suggests, about the politics of sanctuary. And I had a panicked moment last week where I thought, oh, I don't know if my new work actually connects very well with the theme of this series. And so I'll give you some thoughts about how the question of sanctuary and thinking about refuge can help us address questions or think through questions around racialization and inequality as well. And I look forward to a really robust Q&A. I know that this is an audience of people who think about migration. There we go. And so I don't need to, I think, to say very much about the current moment, which is an extremely difficult moment when we think about the politics of migration and the ways in which people are being treated and the ways in which the question of migration is being discussed globally. I think we can focus on the United States as sort of an extreme example, but we recognize that the kinds of conversations happening around migration, around our responsibilities to refugees, are all incredibly difficult. And we're seeing just extraordinary levels of animosity and hate towards people who are mobile, who are migrating across international borders, within borders. And so I've just thrown up a couple of visual and some text to get us thinking about some of the issues that we are confronting in our current moment. So the image is of some of the tents that were planned at Guantanamo Bay to house migrants that the Trump administration is hoping to both quarantine and then deport, and also some of the conversations happening in the media in Canada around migration and the discussion, as always, around illegal migration, illegal migrants, illegal immigrants, undocumented. All of this language has become very, very heavy. And it's a lot for people to, I think, carry, those who are migrating, but also those who work in the field, right, who are thinking about migration and migration research. What does it mean to be working with this in this context where language has become so loaded? And this is what I want to offer in terms of thinking about the history of sanctuary, which I'll talk about for most of the presentation, is really thinking about how the terms migrant and refugee have solidified and have come to signify and be used in such hostile ways. And so in doing the work of thinking about how language is really creating a sense of otherness, I'm inspired by the work of a couple of people. One is Rebecca Hamlin's work, Crossing, How We Label and React to People on the Move, which might be familiar to some of you in the room. Which came out with Stanford University Press a few years ago now, and also work by Erin Glanville, who's here in Vancouver. She has a project called Worn Words, which really is about how language, how discussions of refugees, migrants, and mobility are used to other. And both of these scholars have really inspired the way that I'm thinking about how and why people are labeled in certain ways and the kinds of responses, whoops, I'm going to talk with my hands and try not to hit the mic too often, how responses by civil society in particular to questions of refuge and migration are shaped by politics of language. The other thing that I want to mention just in terms of framing the material that I'm going to offer today is early work by Hannah Arendt, which some of you might know this piece called Race Thinking Before Racism, which came out in the Review of Politics in January 1944. And it's a piece that I return to again and again because I'm never quite sure I understand it. And it's a piece that offers a great deal every time I read it. And essentially what Hannah Arendt was doing in this particular article was trying to understand the relationship between thinking about race and full-fledged racism that was nationalized and politicized. And she ultimately concludes that they're two very different ideas, that you can think about race in one context and not have it mobilized in the kinds of hateful ways that we've seen historically. And so I've just put some of the quotes from this piece up on the slide here as a way of maybe gesturing and helping us understand or think through how language can be used casually and inadvertently, and at moments it becomes very politicized and very mobilized. And I think that's what we're seeing now. And it's not a new phenomena, obviously. And what I want to do today is talk about how sanctuary practices, how the offer of refuge, especially amongst civil society actors, has actually contributed to some of the heaviness and othering that we can see in the language that's being sort of bandied about currently. So we'll move away from this image of Hannah Arendt smoking at the University of Chicago. And I'll talk a little bit about sanctuary specifically. Again, I have the sense that I'm speaking to a room full of very engaged scholars, and so much of this will be familiar, I think. But I want to start by offering a definition of sanctuary, talking about sanctuary in broad terms, and then I'll talk a little bit about a couple of cases that, as I say, help us understand a little bit how the politics of sanctuary, the politics of refuge do contribute to this othering that we have seen in recent years. So sanctuary, and I've done that very lazy academic thing where I've just gone to the Oxford English Dictionary to pull up the definition that we can work with. One of the many definitions that's offered in the dictionary is of sanctuary as a church or other sacred place in which, by the law of the medieval church, a fugitive from justice or a debtor was entitled to immunity from arrest. Hence, in wider sense, applied to any place in which by law or established custom, a similar immunity is secured to fugitives. So this is a very standard definition of sanctuary, but I'll just mention a couple of things about how we might want to think about this definition. One is that it's very different from the kinds of conversations around sanctuary that we're having in our current moment, around sanctuary cities, and really the modern sanctuary movement since the 1980s. Medieval sanctuary practices, which were in fact a division between religious and state authorities, were based on more ancient traditions, which also were part of criminal justice proceedings. So it was not the protection of innocents, not the protection of migrants, the way that we're talking about in our current moment. It really was a practice that was based around fugitives from justice having the time. It was often 40 days in the context of medieval England, where they would be sheltered in a church. And the idea was that while they were sheltered in the church, and these were designated spaces, then all the proceedings around what punishment they ultimately would receive would be finalized. And so sanctuary in the medieval context is so different from how we talk about sanctuary currently. But sanctuary in the medieval context, as well as in ancient times, is consistently evoked as a way of reinforcing or providing authority to contemporary practices. And that's because the contemporary practice of sheltering, whether it's refugees or migrants or fugitives within a sanctuary city or within a church space, that's all customary law. It's not protected in any kind of way. And so especially for church sanctuary practices, people like to evoke these ancient traditions as a way of reinforcing their authority. And so I offer that as a nice historian's caution about using historical references to legitimize contemporary practices, but it's an important distinction, I think one that's gotten lost, especially as we talk about who is deserving of protection, who is worthy of protection. Thinking about sanctuary in a medieval context where it was about criminal fugitives is very different from our contemporary moment. I have been thinking a lot about sanctuary. The book that Antje kindly mentioned has been 8 years in the making, and it came out in October, and I'm so glad that it's out in the world. And I have many, many, many things to say about sanctuary, but I'll just explain a little bit about the genealogy of the project, which, of course, as with all good things, has its roots here at UBC. When I was doing my doctoral research, I became very interested in the kinds of activism that was taking place on behalf of refugees in Asia, and particularly religious activism, thinking about church groups that were lobbying the federal government in particular to resettle refugees from Asia at a time when the federal government was not interested in doing so. And that interest in religious activism translated into questions that I had about sanctuary practices. How was it that people came to be protected in churches, particularly during the 1980s with the sanctuary movement in the United States, and also in the Canadian context, where there were about 30 cases over the course of the early 2000s, from the late 1980s to the 2000s in Canada. So my sort of driving question was, how is it that church groups and religious communities became interested and actively participated in protecting refugees from deportation and ensuring that they had access to asylum determination processes? So I started with that question, and I thought it would be a very easy question to answer because so much of what we talk about when it comes to sanctuary in our current moment is very public, right? We talk about sanctuary cities, these jurisdictions that declare themselves sanctuaries with the idea that people who are undocumented or don't have regular immigration status can still access education, healthcare. It's very, very public. Similarly, since the 1980s, churches that have offered sanctuary often make very public declarations about the people who are in sanctuary as a way of inviting federal authorities, law enforcement, to be aware that there are people in their sanctuary, in their care, and their protection, and to challenge the authority of the state, to challenge the state to do better when it comes to asylum determination, and in some ways to state claims about protection and hospitality vis-a-vis the state. So when I started asking questions about the history of sanctuary and how was it that churches came to be involved, I just assumed that this would be really, really easy to answer. And the reality was, it was very difficult to answer. What I did with a team of really wonderful student researchers was we looked at all kinds of digitized historical newspapers, and we used keywords like sanctuary to try and find historical evidence of when and how people had obtained some kind of protection within a church space. What we discovered is that the term sanctuary from the late 19th to the 20th century gets used most often in the context of wildlife sanctuaries and bird sanctuaries. So it was not church sanctuary that was being described in the newspapers. And then beyond that, what became very clear was that so many incidents of sanctuary had in fact been underground, had been quietly undertaken without publicity. So this whole idea of publicizing sanctuary is a very late 20th, early 21st century phenomena. And I'll come back to this in the conclusion, but just to underscore that it's actually deeply problematic that it's so public. And I think our current moment invites some questions about the nature of public sanctuary work. What I'm showing on the screen are some of the cases that we were able to identify from working with digitized historical newspapers. And as you can see, many of the sanctuary cases mirror where the population in Canada was living. So quite urban descriptions in the newspapers, but we know that people have often found refuge in rural spaces. It just isn't captured in the historical record. So this is partly to explain why the book took 8 years to come together, because that initial research did not take me where I wanted to go in terms of answering questions about how was it that churches in particular became involved in the protection of refugees and migrants. And it just so happened that events in Montreal in 2016, 2017, sparked or moved the research in a different direction. So on the screen, as some of you will recognize, 𝙈𝙞𝙬𝙧𝙖𝙯, former mayor of Montreal, also a former federal immigration minister, and somebody who recently tried to, I think, campaign for the Liberal leadership in Quebec. He's a determined politician. When 𝙈𝙤𝙬𝙧𝙖𝙯 was mayor of Montreal, he became very interested in the question of sanctuary cities. Toronto declared itself a sanctuary city early on. Vancouver, Hamilton, and London have all had conversations about being sanctuary cities, what it means to be a sanctuary city, how do you provide access to people who are residing in a city but might not have legal status. And so the Montreal Sanctuary City Declaration that came about in 2017 was very much at the initiative of Mr. Coderre. It was a unanimous city council decision, and it declared that Montreal would be a sanctuary city, that it would offer services without asking people for their immigration status. It would stop the Montreal Police Service from sharing information with the Canadian Border Services Agency. So the idea is that people would be safe within the city. And that all changed very quickly because with the first Trump administration and things like the Muslim ban, the so-called Muslim ban, the revocation of temporary protections for Haitian migrants in the United States, significant numbers of people started to cross the US-Canada border at Roxham Road, which is the image that you have on this screen, this small country road that has become such a site of contention in Canadian immigration discussions. And so very quickly, when Valérie Plante, the current mayor of Montreal, was elected, Montreal walked back its sanctuary city declaration. It declared that it would be a responsible city, and it would be an inclusive city, but it moved very quickly away from the idea of being a sanctuary city, partly because the pressures that they had experienced with people arriving at Roxham Road and then making their way to the city caused people to ask questions about whether or not Montreal was actually doing a good job of being a sanctuary city. There were images of people housed in the Olympic Stadium, and there was just a sense that there was a lot of need that the city maybe wasn't properly addressing. So this raised all kinds of conversations, or provoked all kinds of conversations about Montreal as a sanctuary city. And it was the flipping, the ease with which a city council could declare itself as declare a city a sanctuary and then walk it back within a few short months that really caught my attention. And I wanted to understand more about that ease that I witnessed in terms of the city's commitment to sanctuary. So what I started to ask, and this is what Sanctuary in Pieces is ultimately about, is what is the substance of sanctuary? What has sanctuary looked like historically? And you'll see that I moved away from thinking about sanctuary specifically in a church context to thinking about sanctuary more broadly. So I took a much more expansive approach to the idea of people being protected or sheltered or welcomed. And I moved very quickly away from thinking specifically about refugees and migrants. Excuse me. Let me catch my breath and have some water. Goodness, all over the place. It was important for me to move away from thinking specifically about refugees and migrants, because I think part of the problem and part of the difficulties that the city of Montreal encountered in making the decision to become a responsible city, and some of the challenges that we're seeing currently, have everything to do with the ways in which sanctuary conversations were narrowed in the late 20th and early 21st centuries to think about protection and hospitality as only the purview or as only necessary for refugees and migrants. The reality is that in our modern contemporary world, people have needed all kinds of refuge in all kinds of circumstances, whether we're thinking about the history of industrialization and urbanization, economic insecurity, homelessness. There are any numbers of ways that we might think about vulnerability, and it hasn't always been around refugees and migrants. And so what I ultimately did as I navigated these shifting terms around sanctuary was to ask the question about what is the substance of sanctuary, how has it looked historically, and how has it changed historically? And so to do that, I did a very deep dive with the history of the city of Montreal. So I chose one site of sanctuary, and working with the historical newspapers, but also in conversations with people who lived in the city and had experiences of sanctuary, I came up with 6 different case studies that help us think about sanctuary really broadly, beyond just the question of refuge, beyond just questions of protecting refugees and migrants. And it's in that really broad exploration that I think we can see some of the impulses for how people have created a sense of safety and community, have created their own forms of sanctuary beyond the purview of the state, beyond welcoming and established communities, but also how these have challenged and maybe force cities to negotiate some of what is meant by sanctuary. So I'll give you a very quick, I know I only have I have a limited time for this talk. Otherwise I would go on and on and on about all the cases that I explored, but I'll give you a quick overview of the the 6 cases that are in Sanctuary Pieces, and then in the Q&A, if you want me to, I'll pick a couple to elaborate more fully, but I'm happy to chat about any of these in the Q&A. This book is a chronological march. So it starts in the late 19th century with the experience of fugitive slaves who crossed the Canada-US border. And what was interesting about looking, and the title of that particular case study is The Lonely City. I was borrowing from Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities for a lot of the inspiration here. The Lonely City reflected the fact that very few fugitive slaves stayed in Montreal, that they may have crossed the border, they may have spent time in the city for a little bit, but in fact, Montreal was not a particularly welcoming place. So it was a very small Black community. And as you'll see in the next case study, it was a city whose politics veered towards the Confederates in the context of the US. And so The Lonely City became about how Montreal was not a place of refuge for fugitive slaves, and talks about people returning to Vermont and other jurisdictions that were safe. So it raises a question of what is safety when you don't have community to support you. The Fugitive City, and this is a case study that I've gotten quite a bit of pushback on, because the Fugitive City looks at the experience of John Surratt in Montreal. John Surratt was a messenger for the Confederates and was suspected in the assassination of President Lincoln. And so after Lincoln's death, Surratt escapes to Montreal. He's supported by a number of local Catholic priests and by a number of people in the city who are very sympathetic to the Confederate cause. And when I first presented this case study, there was somebody in the audience, this was in Quebec, who said, I don't see why you are talking about protection for a criminal, for a fugitive. And it goes back to the point I was making earlier about how our notions of sanctuary have become much more restrictive, and that we actually need to think about instances when undesirable people, so to speak, have been protected. And so the Fugitive City is about John Surratt and all the Confederate support that Montreal offered. And then the next chapter is about the exiled city, and it's a story of Emma Goldman, who was exiled from the United States in 1919. Emma Goldman, before Hannah Arendt, was writing about political refugees. She was writing about persecution for political thinking. So she was exiled to Russia, became deeply disillusioned with the Bolshevik project, and ultimately spends most of her adult career in exile in France, but also in Montreal and Toronto. And she's deeply disappointed by the Canadian context. The revolution is not going to happen in Canada. She's horrified at the strength of the Catholic Church in Montreal, and she despairs of her English anarchist colleagues. She is despondent and miserable in Montreal, does not find the community that she's looking for, but the whole appeal of being in Montreal and Toronto was that it was very close to the United States. So it was a chance for her to try and get back to the United States, where she longed to be. And so her story became an opportunity to think about intellectual networks, transnational networks of community, and the limitations of those networks to provide support in places where people felt like they were quite isolated or encountering hostile circumstances. We only have 3 more case studies, and then I'll do a deep dive. The next one, as I say, it's a chronological march. So the wartime city refers to war resistors in the context of the American war in Vietnam, who made their way to Mexico, to Sweden, but also to Canada in large numbers. And it looks specifically at the experiences of people who moved to Montreal and then encountered the FLQ crisis, the October crisis in 1970, where civil liberties were suspended and the military was on the streets of Montreal. And this is where the book sort of shifts focus, and I spent a lot of time doing oral history interviews from this point on in the project. And it was really interesting talking to people who had chosen to not only stay in Montreal, but also not to return to the United States after 1974 and the amnesty. And they talked about getting up getting caught up in the politics of the national liberation movement in Quebec and the deep sympathy that they felt for French Canadians who were advocating very anti-imperial politics. And what they remembered is that French Canadians were sympathetic to them because they were also anti-imperialist in their politics when it came to the US in Vietnam. And so there was a great deal of affinity and a complicated story of refuge because the federal government had ultimate authority for people being able to stay in Canada, but many of the people who resisted the war in Vietnam were also sympathetic to the French Canadian nationalists who were advocating for liberation from the Canadian federal government. So it became a story of entangled politics. And again, one where community was so important, but one that was defined by these intellectual affinities more than, linguistic experiences or shared experiences. The last two chapters are called The Occupied City and The Uneasy City. And I'm going to spend time talking about each of these cases because they speak to some of the inequalities when it comes to the politics of sanctuary, when it comes to the question of who is migrating, who is receiving shelter, and who is being assisted. So I will move over to talk about each of these case studies. So the Occupied City is the study of Chilean activists in Montreal, beginning in the 1960s, but really culminating in this moment in 1998, where people were occupying churches to make their claims against the federal government visible. And also against the provincial government, I should say. One of the things about looking at the politics of sanctuary in a place like Montreal is that you have municipal politics, but you also have provincial politics and federal politics. And so the history of Chilean and French-Canadian solidarity is a long-standing one. And I'm sure this history will be familiar to many of you, but after the coup in 1973, the federal government in Canada was very reluctant to offer asylum to Chilean refugees. There had to be a fair bit of lobbying to encourage the federal government to intervene. But even in that 1973 moment when Pinochet was coming to power, Chileans were not waiting to be rescued. They were occupying embassies, they were seeking ways out of Chile, and many of the people doing so were leftist activists. And so this is where some of the concern around providing refuge came in the Canadian context. After the coup in 1973, the Canadian embassy in Santiago was occupied by a number of I shouldn't say it was occupied. A number of people seeking refuge in Canada sought shelter in the embassy. And this was met with a fair bit of disdain. The ambassador to Chile was known as a fairly conservative fellow. He'd been buying a luxury car in Buenos Aires when the coup happened. And so he had to get back and discovered that there were all these people in the embassy trying to obtain refuge. And so the Canadian government's response was a reluctant one. Even in 1973, though, the solidarity between French Canadians and Chilean activists was very noticeable, particularly because of labor circles, also a long-standing French Canadian missionary presence. And so there are a number of people who are resettled as refugees after 1973. The federal government also develops a program to support political prisoners. And so there is quite a bit of entangled history when it comes to Chile and Canada after 1973. That relationship or that history was not always an easy one. And in 1987 and 1990 in particular, Chileans in Canada who were seeking to have their immigration status regularized began the practice of occupying federal immigration offices to draw attention to their concerns, their opposition to the imposition of visas. And this happens in 1987 and again in 1990, and it's fairly widely publicized. And in addition to their activism being publicized, so too is the response of the federal government. So I've included one quote from the then Minister of Immigration, Benoit Bouchard, who says, "I find it absolutely staggering that after 2 or 3 days in a country, one can find the time and the ability to contest its laws. That bowls me over. You've hardly had time to arrive in the country and you're already contesting its laws." So he's clearly frustrated with Chileans who are taking it upon themselves to express their frustration with Canada's visa regulations, with Canada's immigration laws. And the reason that this case study became so interesting to me was that this was not an instance where anyone was offering to help or to provide protection. These were Chileans who, of their own volition, of their own decision-making, decided that they would protest the kinds of policies that they were seeing being introduced by the federal government. So there's this history of activism in the context of the 1973 coup. We see it in subsequent years when it came to this, the imposition of visas, and it becomes quite marked in 1998, which is what I focus on with this idea of the occupied city. So just as context, 1998, we're thinking about post-1995 referendum politics in Canada. So the question of Quebec independence has been at the forefront of a lot of the discussions between Quebec and Canada. And this manifests in contests over immigration policy, right? The provincial government is increasingly determined to have its say around who can stay, who belongs in Quebec. And so post-referendum, this is quite peaked. 1998 is also when there's a huge ice storm in Quebec. And some of the Chileans I interviewed for this chapter talked about feeling very vulnerable in the context of the ice storm because they didn't have proper immigration status. So they didn't know if they could go and get support from the local food banks or shelters because they were worried about revealing their immigration status in doing that. And so there's a sense of vulnerability for people who did not necessarily have legal status in Canada. And so in the winter of 1998, in February, 30 individuals present themselves at a large Catholic church, which is now a condo, 𝙍𝙖𝙘𝙞𝙤𝙯, and they occupy the church. And they're occupying the church on behalf of 106 people, but there are only 30 individuals who make their way into the church, and they force the congregation to decide whether or not they will provide refuge. And so this is not an instance where the church has decided to invite people in, to offer refuge. This is an instance where activists have decided that they are going to occupy the church in order to draw attention to their situation. They want the federal and provincial governments to resolve their immigration status, and they want it done, in short order. The church officials that I spoke with, so the Reverend and some members of the congregation, talked about the very difficult decision that they were confronted with. They did see it as a difficult decision. They resented the fact that people had simply presented themselves to be protected or to use the church as a sort of a political base. They had in mind too, and this had happened a few years prior in France, where the sans-papiers had, so people without documents had occupied churches in Paris, and the police had gone in on that occasion and removed people from Saint-Bernard. And that had caused quite a bit of media sensationalism. And so the congregation was well aware of this precedent, which was an unusual one. It is unusual for law enforcement to go into these sacred spaces. So the congregation ultimately decided that they would offer refuge to the Chilean activists, but they would only do so on sort of a week-by-week basis. So this got negotiated again and again and again. And things became dramatic when people decided to go on a hunger strike. And this was something else that Chilean activists had done previously, both in the wake of 1973, but also during the occupation of immigration offices in 87 and 90. There had been hunger strikes that had drawn attention and sort of reinforced the severity or the seriousness of the cause. And 𝙤😅🕋 has a really interesting study of prison strikes, hunger strikes in the context of US prisons, and talks about really the power of this bodily protest. And certainly the media attention in Quebec and in Canada increased dramatically once the hunger strike started. And you'll notice that on the images here, I've blocked out people's faces, and I'll say a little bit more about that when I get to the next case study. But what is, I hope you can see from the images, is that when the media is focused on the hunger strike, they're focused on people who are lying prone. There's a real sense of maybe passivity, vulnerability. They're not active in the way that the image to the very right indicates when the fast ends and they're sort of celebrating. So there's a visual narrative that's being communicated here in terms of, I mean, physically, what people were sacrificing in order to pursue their hunger strike. And then ultimately, when the hunger strike ends, we see this kind of victorious and strong celebration. The hunger strike, ultimately what happens is the strike is very effective, and a number of prominent labor leaders, musicians, activists, or political leaders in Quebec come together and pressure the provincial government and the federal government to negotiate a conclusion. The idea that's negotiated is that everyone has to leave the country and reapply, and this becomes very complicated because some people can't go to the US, they're not allowed entry. Some people go to Mexico. This causes a considerable amount of anxiety amongst those who have been occupying the church because they're just not sure about whether or not they can trust federal authorities in this instance. And sure enough, 2 families are deported before that immigration procedure can run its course. So the negotiation around resolving the interests of the Chileans who are protesting in this moment is a complicated one. And ultimately, they occupy the church again in the fall of 1998. They don't feel that either the provincial government or the federal government have adequately addressed their concerns. And that time, that occupation is much more short-lived. And when I talked to people about their experiences, they just said that the public sentiment wasn't there, that the second occupation was actually seen quite poorly, as in people had really overstayed their welcomes. And so this really raises questions about who has the power to seek refuge, what happens if you're not invited in. Sort of going to your point, Antje, in the introduction, thinking about what does a welcome look like. This was an instance where migrants, people without status, were making a decision for themselves about how they wanted to resolve their situation. They had specific demands for the provincial and federal government. And yet the moment that they actively pushed that question or pushed that conversation, people were much more reluctant to provide assistance. It wasn't the church, it wasn't the government that had the opportunity to offer refuge, and that made the whole thing much more complicated. And just thinking about this particular case is that it reminds us of the great power inequalities that do exist when we talk about the politics of sanctuary or the politics of refuge, that there is both implicit and explicit expectations about how that refuge will be offered. And it's not necessarily refuge that is meant to be taken. And so I think this is where some of the conversations around queue jumpers, around illegality, there is a standard narrative, I think, both in the Canadian and US context about these countries as places of refuge, but the ultimate decision-making really is meant to rest with the authorities, or in this case, with the church that was asked to provide refuge. So it speaks to some of the inequalities if the moment people are seeking or making their own forms of refuge, that becomes problematic. So I'll leave that as a little grain to think about, but it does take us back to an earlier period where people were in fact forging their own forms of refuge and weren't necessarily doing so vis-a-vis the federal, state, or the provincial government. And it does, I think, raise really important questions about the capacity to create refuge as community beyond the legal parameters of the state. I'm going to drill this home with an example or discussion of the last case study in the book, which is actually a series of case studies, but I'll just distill it here in the interest of time. So the last chapter is called The Uneasy City, and it's about the very uneasy politics that marked Montreal in the early 2000s, when organizations like Solidarity Across Borders were very invested in arguing for substantive immigration reform, very interested in questions of sanctuary cities, but also solidarity cities, and seeing the possibility for solidarity beyond refuge and migration, thinking about solidarity with Indigenous peoples, solidarity in terms of questions of unhoused, costs of living, and the needs of refugees and migrants. So activist organizations like Solidarity Across Borders have this very broad understanding of the need for immigration reform as a substantive immigration reform as a way of making all communities safer and more welcoming. And so in this particular case study, which looks at St. Mark's Church, which has also been sold, I will say that all of the churches that I did oral history interviews with for the later part of the book, so the early 2000s, they've all been sold and made into condos with the exception of one. So this says something about maybe the state of organized religion in Quebec, in Montreal in particular, and we can have a conversation about that in terms of the authority of the church. Because I will say one of the very early conversations that I had around church sanctuary was with an Indigenous woman who lives here in British Columbia. And I sort of said very cavalierly, I'm working on this project on church sanctuary, and sanctuary, churches are safe places. And she said, well, they haven't been safe for Indigenous peoples. And it was a moment where really made me think about that question of moral authority and the ways in which churches are pursuing a kind of moral authority as they offer refuge and protection. And so for St. Mark's, I did an extensive number of interviews with Reverend Chris Beauregard, talking about this instance where the church had offered refuge to a woman who stayed with them for about 11 months. And for Reverend Beauregard, he talks about the opportunity to provide refuge as a way of testing what it means to be a community of faith. And so he saw it both as and he was the one who convinced the congregation that they should offer sanctuary. And he saw it as an instance where they could provide protection for somebody who was making their way through a number of very complicated asylum determination processes. But he also saw it as something that would enliven and help the spiritual life of his congregation. And so in this particular instance, the woman in sanctuary was an elderly woman who had a number of health issues. Her husband had been deported, and her deportation was stayed because of all the health issues. And Solidarity Across Borders took on her case and then tried to find a church to shelter her while they continued with their activism and the lawyers continued to work on her case. So I had the opportunity in this particular instance to sit down with members of the congregation. The woman in question unfortunately passed away a few years ago, so I wasn't able to interview her about her experiences. But I did talk to people in the congregation about the decision to offer sanctuary. And it was really striking how many felt very, very reluctant about doing so. They worried about Canadian Border Services agents coming into the church. They worried about how long their commitment to provide protection or shelter was going to go on for. And so you can see with some of the quotes that I put up on the screen here, some people expressed a lot of doubt. Other people expressed their concern that the church was going to smell like spices. This woman was from Pakistan, and so there was an immediate sort of conjuring of otherness in terms of culinary practices. There was concern about the cost because normally the church was rented out. The church basement where she lived was rented out for activities which supported the church. And so people worried about losing out financial benefits. And then the other thing that came through in the interviews was this hope that the congregation had that they would actually have a shared experience, that by offering refuge, offering shelter, that in fact some kind of connection would be made. And what one member described instead was the woman in sanctuary being very much like the Phantom of the Opera, that she wasn't really there, wasn't really participating in the life of the congregation. Her religion was not theirs. And so with these interviews, you got a sense of like the deep power inequalities, the expectations that the congregation had of somebody who was vulnerable because of the refugee determination processes she was going through. And they understood that vulnerability, but they also had these expectations of what it would mean to offer shelter and protection. And so this particular case, as I say, the woman in question was granted refugee status in Canada, but it did take a toll on her health, is what I gather from what people said about the experience. And it reminded me, you know, in having these conversations, as I say, of the great power inequalities. And those inequalities came out within the practice of sanctuary, within the church, because it ultimately parallels and reinforces the authority of the state, right? The church was making decisions about whether or not to offer protection, which is exactly what federal authorities do when they're making refugee determination processes. So the premise of sanctuary in our contemporary moment is that it is in opposition to state interests or state practices. And in fact, I think the two are actually quite aligned. And where this became very clear to me was in my effort to interview another family. And I'll just end with this story because I think it speaks, as I say, both to the question of racialization and also inequalities. This was a family that had been in sanctuary for about 7 months. And I was able through this is from a different congregation. One of the congregation members helped me find the woman who'd been the parent in the situation. She'd been in sanctuary with her children. And when I asked her if I could interview her, she said, no, absolutely not. I don't want to talk about this experience. And then she said, not only that, I don't want to talk to you about sanctuary. It's very difficult. And she said, I don't want you to write about it. I don't want, like, that part of my life is over. I don't want to go back to it. I don't want to dwell on it. Her case had been very, very mediatized. There were newspaper stories about her living in a gilded cage and that kind of very evocative language. And I have to say, it for somebody who is, you know, trying to write this history of sanctuary, to shed light on, you know, how sanctuary has functioned historically and how it sits in our contemporary moment, the idea of not telling her story was a really challenge. And I will say, I'd already drafted the chapter, and so, like, I was ready to tell the story, and I absolutely respected her wishes and walked back from that. So it's not in the book, and it's also what encouraged me not to put the images or the faces of people who have been mediatized during their moment in sanctuary, not to perpetuate that mediatization when I talk about their stories now. Because one of the things that came up through that interaction was the sense of having been made vulnerable by the very sanctuary practices that were meant to protect and offer a legal venue to asylum. So it was a very sobering lesson, and it was not one that I expected when I started doing this work, but it was a reminder of just the deep inequalities that animate questions of refuge and sanctuary in our current moment and in our current society, and certainly something that I'm thinking about as we hear about you know, the current Trump administration going after sanctuary cities, going after the idea of safe spaces in the United States. I think there's an urge to want to return to those spaces, but I think it's also an opportunity to think about how the work might be done differently, and certainly done in a way where people's priorities, people being migrants, whoever is in need of protection, where they are actually the ones who are establishing what is most important and how they want to proceed with their life trajectories. So I will end there, but I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Laura. I was thinking maybe you should put sanctuary into plural, given how, I mean, I was just struck by how diverse all these cases are that you talk about in the historical change.
Yeah.
I was also thinking about how so much of what you talk about the contemporary cases remind me of many critiques of private refugee sponsorship.
Yeah.
And the power imbalances, which seems very, very similar. And I was also struck by people like I've done some work in German context on sanctuary, and where some congregations really seek to extend sanctuary in order to proselytize.
Yes.
In another religious community. So deeply flawed. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for everything you put out there.
Thank you.
I look forward to the conversation we're about to have. I first have to give you some instructions. So first of all, we'll be alternating between in-person and the online audience. We'll have 2 in-person questions and 1 the online, that's trying to do. The online folks, if you please use the Q&A function, and then, all right? Sorry, Anjali, you have to speak into a mic.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay, apologies to the online audience. We're going to move into a Q&A period. 2 questions from the audience in the room, 1 from you online. Please use the Q&A function if you want, and then your question will be read out. And for everybody, whether online or in the room, please introduce yourself by name and the department or unit that you're from. Okay. You ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So who is you talking right now? Okay, we're walking right.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. So my name is Aryan. I'm a faculty member at in sociology here. I think I have a question about the piece by Hannah Arendt that you introduced earlier. And it's linked, I think, to the final sentences that you wrapped up your presentation with about how can we do things differently. So I teach this paper, Race Before Racism, in my class. My students find it interesting and I admire that piece. So I was wondering what is exactly, like, it's not about this project maybe, but as a conversation amongst colleagues, right? What is exactly, how can I use this piece going forward? As I said, I teach it, to think about migration and the idea of sanctuary and the idea of the bigger picture of deservingness in society, who gets to be here, not only to stay in the church, but to be here in Canada, right? How can it help us, as you said, in the end, especially in this political environment? Thank you.
Yeah, I would love to know what your students think of the piece as well. It's one that I keep going back to. And as I say, to me, what is so compelling about this piece is the idea of language and concepts becoming thicker and the potential for certain concepts to become politicized, to become mediatized. And I don't think it was ever the intention for the term refugee, for instance, to become such a what's the word? A flashpoint in conversations around deservedness and belonging. We think about something like the 1951 Refugee Convention. It's very clear that the purpose of that convention is to offer some kind of protection, and it uses and defines the term refugee. And of course, the term refugee was used before the convention, is used beyond it, and it has become so loaded. And I think that also applies to questions of migration as well, right? The ways in which the term migrant is meant to denote some kind of difference, some kind of otherness. And I think one of the things that might be useful for us all to think about is that refuge and protection have never been the explicit purview of a state, that they have been concepts that have been forged in community. And that's sort of what I was gesturing to in my final reflections, that if we attend to the ways in which communities have, in fact, evolved in ways that they can potentially become safe spaces for people. Not always. And I also had interesting conversations as I was doing this research around, I was really putting the onus on community, and then some of my interlocutors were saying, well, that's not always been the case for, LGBTQ members of particular communities, right? Where they've in fact felt persecuted by their own communities. But I do think that shifting the focus away from legal forms of protection, from state pronouncements about refuge, that it opens up the possibility for thinking about where and how communities have actually done that hard work and have created those safe spaces. And that to me opens up many, many possibilities. Maybe going to your point, Antje, about thinking about sanctuary in the plural, right? That the default has been to think about state protection. And I think that's actually a mistake. And I think the ways in which the language or the discourse around migration and refuge has become so deeply politicized in our current moment, building on decades of politicization, is actually a reminder why we might think about moving away from the state as a guarantor of security.
Yeah, I was first.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Laura. My name is 𝙈𝙤𝙬𝙘𝙤𝙬 I'm a co-director of the Center for Migration Studies. I would love to hear a little bit more about your thinking about sanctuary and the way we should reimagine it or stretch it or get rid of it, given its relationship to Christianity in particular. So I was really struck by your map where all the congregations seem to be Christian congregations with maybe one Sikh Gurudwara that might be in there.
Yeah.
No synagogues, no alternative places. And then your examples of Montreal did not include, as far as I could understand, anything about Jewish refugees around World War II.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious what your thinking is, because I could imagine appeals to Christianity in a Christian majority country could be resonant, but also might be alienating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I think it is a dual, there's a dual dimension, right? Where in particular, where Christian churches have really pulled on this idea of sanctuary as a way of legitimizing or reinforcing their desire to work with certain refugees and certain migrants. And so there is, it dates to that medieval tradition, and they've evoked it without, I think, necessarily thinking about the really critical differences. They've evoked it in terms of the moral authority that they think the church can carry. And I think, yeah, so, and the question has been, in part, the extent to which states will respect the idea of sanctuary when it happens in non-Christian spaces. So it's been questionable in the Canadian context, where law enforcement was very present at the Sikh Gurudwara, where 𝙈𝙤𝙬𝙬 Singh was waiting for deportation. There was a mosque in Montreal where an imam was removed, not from the physical space of the mosque, but from the grounds around it, which hasn't happened in the context of Christian churches. There's one instance in Quebec City where the local police went in to the church and removed an Algerian activist. But by and large, the moral authority that churches have evoked in doing this work has been respected by the Canadian state. I have this new research project on sanctuary in Texas in the 1980s. And what's really striking there is that a number of the activists who are on the border are Jewish. And they're relying on support from synagogues in Madison, Wisconsin, and in Tucson. So they're not offering the physical protection that we see with this sort of medieval tradition, but they are very much engaged in questions of sanctuary and protection. And what they're evoking is stories of persecution in the biblical context, but they also, on a number of occasions, reference the Nuremberg principles and how it is the responsibility not only of states to offer protection, but that it's an individual responsibility. And so I think in addition to thinking about the physical spaces where people might be seeking sanctuary, there's also the kind of intellectual and philosophical and moral underpinnings for that work. And it's much broader than I think the physical space of a church suggests. And I think we've seen that in the context of sanctuary city movements, solidarity city movements. Jennifer Begelman's written quite a bit about this, where the notion of sanctuaries become much more fluid and deterritorialized. And so it incorporates many more I think religious influences and philosophical influences, but it's really interesting to see the ways in which historical precedent or historical examples are evoked. And I'll just say, this is probably tangential to what you're asking about, but in the context of what we now know is, or is often described as the Underground Railroad, people involved in the sanctuary movement in the 1980s evoked that particular history of churches and abolitionists providing refuge. And people have pushed back against that in terms of whether or not it's an appropriate reference point, given that the Underground Railroad was made by fugitive slaves who sought their freedom, and it wasn't given by white churches. And so that has become part of the discussion. And so I think the history of sanctuary is actually a lot more fraught in terms of a political movement than I realized. And I think your question about what does that particular organized, what does that mapping of a particular kind of organized religion tell us? But also, what does it maybe hide or leave out? And there's a lot that it leaves out.
Yes, so someone in the chat is saying, I think there is a chicken egg question lurking in the background. As you say, in our historical moment, everything depends on the state. But the state in a democracy can only operate within the bounds of social license, which is kind of shaped around public opinion. When public opinion changes, policies change. In your understanding, what shapes public opinion on the issues you explore?
Yeah, that's a great question about public opinion and the role it plays. I will say that one of the reasons churches in the 1980s, or I should say sanctuary, they call themselves, many of the people involved in these movements call themselves sanctuary workers. And one of the reasons that they decided that having people be in shelter in churches was that it would be a way to try and mobilize public opinion. And so the idea was to, and especially in the context of the 1980s, where so much of the activism was about the injustices taking place in Central America. So the Reagan administration funding conflicts in Guatemala and Honduras and Nicaragua. Sanctuary workers were very, very aware of that foreign policy dimension. And so part of the thinking was if people were sheltered in a church, they could use that sheltering to mobilize public opinion, to not only encourage or provide, gain support for these asylum claims that were being denied at astronomical levels, but also raise public awareness about the conflicts in Central America that were leading people to migrate. And so there was a very deliberate and conscientious decision to think about public opinion in that context. And again, just to go back to my point about the ways in which some of these sanctuary practices have mirrored state practices. There were examples, I think it's in San Diego. There's a congregation that there's a whole network of people who are trying to figure out which congregations will be supportive and where they can find people to shelter. And this congregation in San Diego says, well, we'll take this refugee into sanctuary, but not this person, because this person can't speak to their experiences the way that this person can. And that's not going to be as valuable if we're going to mobilize public opinion. And it's a really stark example of the politicization of sanctuary, but it's happening in the context of these churches offering refuge. And it's about thinking about the impact of what a particular person in sanctuary will mean for broader public opinion. So I think the question, so that's an example of, maybe in the weeds in terms of how sanctuary relates to public opinion. But I think more broadly, the question of public opinion has so much to do with how people understand or think about the role of their society and their government and its capacity to provide refuge and welcome at like a really broad scale. And that's not always, and people don't always think about it in broad terms, right? There's often a narrowing in terms of certain people are desirable. And then that feeds into the discourse that is produced around who is being sheltered. It's, the care with which the cases are presented as legitimate and just and deserving. It creates inequities in terms of anyone who's not in sanctuary. What does that mean for their possibilities of refuge and protection? I don't know if that answers the question. I feel like it could go on many. I'd be curious to hear other people's thoughts on this question of public opinion, but that's the way I read it. I think that sanctuary workers are very aware of public opinion, and they're thinking about their practices in terms of how public opinion can be swayed. And I think the question of public opinion actually serves to divide who is given the opportunity or who is offered protection in these cases.
Okay, let's move back here. Dale, and if you want to get online. If you don't get in the queue, just raise your hand and keep it up till you've caught my eye, and I'll write you down.
Hi, my name is Dale McCartney. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Arts and Integrated Studies at the University of the Fraser Valley. I actually want to pick up on what you were saying at the end there. When you were talking in the final case study about the dangers of mediatization, I was thinking about sanctuary efforts in Vancouver of war resistors during the Iraq War.
Yeah.
And the way that they used mediatization to particularly advance, and I think not only a campaign about refuge, but a campaign of like an anti-war campaign.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if I hear what you're saying about the dangers of this political process, but I wonder if is there actually something useful and strategic about participating in the media discourses, particularly in order to try to advance these political goals? Because I don't think they obviously didn't win their goals, but it does feel like they were pretty influential in that particular moment.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was my big question.
Yeah, it's a great question about, and I said I was going to stop researching sanctuary, but I've become really interested in this question of sanctuary and the Iraq War, because many of the war resistors in Vietnam advocated on behalf of people who are in here in Vancouver and living in churches. And I think maybe the distinction to be drawn around this question of mediatization is whether or not people are willing participants in that mediatized process, understanding that, I mean, we all make the decisions as best we can given our circumstances. I'm not sure that the people, especially the woman who asked me not to talk about her story, I'm not sure that she was aware of, I'm not sure that she was given a lot of choice about telling her story to the media. And again, this goes back to some fairly elaborate discussions that lawyers and sanctuary workers have around, if someone goes into sanctuary, what is our strategy? And there's a media strategy, there's a legal strategy. And the interesting thing about our digital world is you don't get to leave that history behind. And so that public activism, that mediatization, it lives on in the digital verse. And I think my understanding of the case in Vancouver, I think was it Kyle? I'm trying to remember the name of yeah. My sense is that he was much more deliberate about the fact that he wanted to have the case mediatized. And it's really what I hadn't anticipated, but that case of Vietnam War resistors using their experiences to advocate on behalf of resistors in the context of the war in Iraq, that plays out in San Francisco, in Berkeley. So there's actually quite a large story, I think, to be told about the ways in which the protection of military individuals, how that complicates our understanding of sanctuary. So very different from refugees and migrants. And the first public case of sanctuary in the late 20th century is in Berkeley in 1971, where they protect soldiers who don't want to go back to Vietnam from the USS Coral Sea. And that incentivizes the city of Berkeley to also, Irene will know this more than I, but incentivizes the city of Berkeley to also declare itself a sanctuary city in that moment. And so the first case is about military, it's about soldiers, it's not about refugees and migrants. And so that, I mean, your question wasn't about complicating the genealogy, but I think there's a lot, it invites us or offers us the opportunity to think about that question of fugitive, question of criminality, and then the question of deservedness. So thank you for reminding me of that thread as well.
Okay, Renisa in the front there.
I'm Renisa Mawani. I teach in the Department of Sociology. And Laura, it's great to see you. Thank you for your talk. I have two very sort of prosaic questions. The first is, since you emphasize so much the point about the importance of language, I'm interested in your title and why your title is Otherness. As opposed to racism or racialization. And then I'm glad you brought it back to the first slide, because I'm also really interested in the image. And I'm wondering if you can tell us about the image and, which, as you were talking, I mean, it is a kind of palimpsest underneath all of the other slides. So yeah, just would really like to hear more.
Thank you. I'm glad you asked those two questions. The title is very much inspired by the series that the center has run. And my own thinking around race and racialization, because one of the things that I've been really struck by with the sanctuary research is the question of class and gender. And so often, especially in our current moment, I think the discussion around migrants is so racialized, but there's a pronounced economic dimension. And to me, otherness was a way of evoking difference beyond just race, but very much inspired by the series and the title of the series. But I wanted to get at maybe the other dimensions. And the other thing is, and I think I forgot to say this in the talk, but I think, this question of offering sanctuary or protection, it does reinforce a profound sense of otherness, right? Who has the capacity, the resources, the sanction to do that work. And there is this, I think, constant sort of reiteration of countries like the United States and Canada as places of refuge because they offer protection and asylum, whether it's by civil society actors or the state. And to me, the very idea that certain countries are going to be the ones that offer protection and not others, or certain societies have that capacity or not others, or certain groups, that to me reinforces a great deal of it perpetuates otherness in, I think, a really profound way. And it goes maybe to the question that Irene was asking about, what does it mean that we see churches as, sanctioned to offer sanctuary, but not other spaces? And that's been one of the really interesting shifts, I think, in recent years, where there's increasingly this idea of, secular sanctuary. So people in hospitals, right? Can law enforcement go into a hospital? And so, yeah, I just think that otherness to me was a way of maybe distilling a lot of different pieces that I think inform these great inequities around sanctuary. So that was what I was doing with that title. But it really was inspired by the series because I wanted to speak to the work that's been happening here. The question of the image, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention this. This is the cover art for the book for Sanctuary in Pieces. And those of you in the room have their postcards distributed all over the table. So please feel free to take a postcard, which has this image. It's a painting called The Epic and the Monumental, and it's done by Mary Harmon, who was a war resister I interviewed, who moved with her husband to Montreal in the 1960s. And she was really interesting. She was one of the few people I talked to who described poverty. She described childhood poverty in Ohio and talked about her great sense of alienation being in Montreal, not having the language to connect with French Canadians in the city, and feeling very, very lonely in Montreal. And so she was parenting two young children at the time of the FLQ crisis, and she was very, very evocative in her phrasing. She said, I didn't have time for my women's lib movement. I was with my kids, and I didn't have time to deal with the FLQ crisis. Like, she was very, very removed from a lot of the politics that I was interested in exploring. But her, when I found her because of her website. She describes herself as a war resister on her website. And so I noticed her art first, and I asked her if I could use this particular image for the cover, largely because of the bridge. I thought that was really evocative. But I will say that in the original painting, and I'm sorry it's not in this version, there on the right-hand side at the very bottom, there's an image. If you go to her website, Mary Harmon, you'll see that there's a little girl with black hair flowing and big, big eyes, and she looks terrified. And when the graphic designers were working on the cover of the book, they removed, I think they had to crop, and so that got removed. And I asked Mary, I felt very, trepidatious about this, approaching an artist saying, we've removed some of your painting. Are you okay with this? And she said, yeah, I think we should just focus on the bright and the light. And so it's okay if that scary image is not on the cover. So yeah, so it's a slight variation of the original painting. But thank you for the question, because yeah, it means a lot that somebody who participated in the project, that I was able to share her work in this way.
Okay, we still have space for more questions. I'll insert myself and then Amanda. And I kind of centering race, I'd love to hear more about your first case study of the lonely city and, case study of fugitive slaves moving into Montreal. And I want to ask it as an open question, whatever you think you want to share about it in terms of what's important for us to know about that.
Yeah, I mean, I did not think I was going to write about the Underground Railroad at all when I started this project. And it's a bit strange, I guess, for me to say that because it is evoked, as I say, so often with subsequent sanctuary movements where people talk about the new Underground Railroad, and it's getting evoked again. As I think much of the sanctuary work that has happened in the past few years is in the wake of what's happened in the U.S. I think some of that's going underground. So the symbolism of the Underground Railroad is really, really prominent. And of course, in the Canadian context, it's evoked as representative of this country's history of refuge. And it's much more problematic than that, largely because the question of the Underground Railroad privileges those people who were maybe located in particular sites and doesn't foreground the actual movement of people, which is what was so critical for shaping the Underground Railroad, right? It was the actual movement of enslaved people away from jurisdictions where slavery was legal. So they went south to Mexico, they came north to British North America. And so I wasn't convinced that was a story that I wanted to explore, largely because it's a story of not sanctuary in the Montreal context. There are so few people who move to Montreal leaving situations of bondage and who stay. They often go to Toronto, they return to Vermont, they don't stay in Montreal. And from what I can gather, it's just that there was not a significant community to support them. They found a hostile city. They found a lonely city. They found a city where there had been histories of slavery. And I spent a lot of time going through hospital records to see if anyone, or hospital records and what would have been the homeless shelter in the city, to try and find evidence of fugitive slaves having made their way to the city and sought shelter there. And what I found instead were people who had been enslaved who ultimately were handed over to the nuns, and some of them passed away in the hospital, and so it wasn't a story of people from elsewhere ending up in these shelters, but actually local residents who had been previously enslaved. And I think I ended up writing about this topic in part because of that large narrative about the Northern Star and about Canada as a place of refuge. Some of you may know the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a very popular anti-slavery tract. It ends in Montreal. The family is happily reunited in Montreal. And so it has fed that myth of the North Star. And so ultimately, I think the chapter became an opportunity to talk about the history of slavery in Canada, to talk about Montreal as a city, but maybe as a bit of a metaphor for the country more broadly, as not being a place of refuge. And so this book that is about sanctuary in so many shapes and forms actually starts with this chapter where there is no sanctuary to be found. And it is about questions, it is about race, it's about the history of slavery in Canada, and it's also about that inability to forge community, which becomes such an important through thread in latter parts of the story.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really glad you included that. And I think as we're learning more about the history of slavery in Canada and also slaves moving to the northern states in the US for refuge, right? We always think of it one way, but it's so complex.
Yeah.
Okay, Amanda.
Hi, Laura. My name is Amanda Cheong, and I'm an assistant professor in the sociology department. I'm really looking forward to reading your book. I found that the story that you told about the Chilean activists was so revealing in terms of how state and non-state actors conceived of who is the good refugee and who is the bad refugee, and how refugees should be grateful but not overly dependent, or that they should be vulnerable but they can't be too needy. And I know that, and the way that the Chilean asylum seekers asserted themselves was completely in contravention to the expectations that receiving actors had about how a refugee should behave. And as you started the talk by saying how sanctuary had historically not been intended for innocent people. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about what your findings mean for this expectation or this paradox that refugees have to be meet this impossible standard of innocence.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for the question. Yeah, I think given our current moment, I think we've all been having conversations about how easily refugees and migrants are being dehumanized, right? With the kind of really violent rhetoric, but also policies that, have people quarantined in certain places and deported elsewhere. But I think the whole question of dehumanization, it actually goes and this is ultimately what I came to think about as I was doing this work. I think it's actually dehumanizing to expect people to be extraordinary and to carry the weight of being a refugee for so many others, right? To be a deserving or good migrant for, you can't make any mistakes. And I think that's a lot to bear. And I think it's so profoundly unfair. And it's, again, it goes to these concerns that I have about the ways in which we mediatize or publicize certain people's experiences, where all the complexity of being human, all of our frailties and our imperfections, people don't get to carry those. And that I think is profound. I find that profoundly troubling. So I don't know if I'm answering your question if I say, yeah, I think it's profoundly troubling, but I do worry about this. The critical refugee studies folks have done such beautiful work around the exceptional and the extraordinary refugee. And I think that what I would advocate for is maybe to move away from labels like refugees and migrants, which are in some ways, all about the legal status, and talk about people as humans. What is this human doing? What is this person doing? And actually, as activists or as researchers, to remove ourselves from some of the categories that we know are used to regulate, to make people legible in certain ways. I say this knowing that there's lots of work about how we should stop thinking about humans in the Anthropocene and actually think more broadly about the environment. So I'm aware of the limitation of saying, why don't we just talk about people as human beings? But I even as I was giving the talk today, I was very aware that I kept saying refugees and migrants, and how different would that talk have sounded if I had simply talked about humans and people throughout. So I'm not going to redo the talk, but I leave that, that's something to think about. Yeah.
And I'm also glad you talked about, how much racialization underpins all of that, and deservingness. We talk about deservingness and we talk about racialized groups. White folks really have to prove their deservingness. Yeah. And so, we want to thank you for, I feel it's been a very unsettling conversation about how we think about sanctuary, that sometimes, it's a feel-good word, and I don't think we're left with that feeling. So thank you for that. And thank you for all of you for your questions. And just please join me in thanking Laura for a fantastic talk. Okay, this concludes the speaker series, but I've got 4 brief announcements, some more events for this term. This one is for graduate students, early career scholars in particular. We'll be hosting a professional development event with Lily Grewal, who is the Director of Immigrant Integration for the BC government. That will be on March 31st. Details are on the website. Then our final community luncheon will be on April 3rd. Again, you can just turn up, eat, and just get to know folks. It's always a great place to really make new connections and deepen existing ones. Number 3 is our annual research conference, which will take place in collaboration with UEC Okanagan on May 1st and 2nd on this campus. And then please subscribe to our mailing list. Keep an eye out on the CMS website for more information. And last but not least, you see the QR code on the tables. Please fill out a feedback survey one type of feedback we're actually really interested in is, that we finished this theme in terms of our speaker series, but we're already starting to think, what about next academic year? And if you've got idea of a theme that you think would be really fruitful for us to engage with over the course of an entire year, please note it down, because it'd be great to hear from you. So thank you again.